Welcome to the Indie Author Blueprint podcast, where we break down the ins and outs of self-publishing to help you succeed on your writing journey. I'm your host, Michelle Rayburn, and today we're talking about something every indie author needs to nail: book covers. We've been talking about covers with some examples of makeovers and talking a little bit about the look of the outside and some of the benefits to having a professional designer versus trying to do it yourself. But now we need to talk specifically about the technical side of book covers. This is where a lot of indie authors get stuck, and it's also where a lot of indie authors are overconfident about how it's going to go. Now, I say that not because I want to discourage anybody, but because I want you to go into it with the reality of knowing there could be things that come up that you don't know how to handle. If you're used to working with words and that's your specialty, it's kind of like me, we're working with words, or working with graphic design is my specialty. But if you give me numbers and you ask me to do accounting, it's going to make my head spin. Well, that's sometimes what happens when publishing platforms start talking about color specifications and bleed and margins and all that kind of stuff. So creating the cover that looks great is only half the battle. The other half is making sure that it meets technical requirements for the platforms while you be publishing. And that means you want to make sure your margins look right and it's not chopped off, and you have your images all in the right format so they look crisp and clear. So whether you're using Amazon KDP or Ingram Spark or even Barnes & Noble Press, which is something I haven't worked with, but it's out there, each platform has specific guidelines. And trust me, meeting those guidelines is essential if you want your book to come out looking professional. So let's dive into the key technical aspects you need to consider. The first thing we're going to be talking about is trim size and aspect ratio. Now, trim size, think of it as the finished size that you want your book to be. So when you're holding it in your hands, when all the edges are trimmed off, what size is it going to be? Now, the reason that we talk about trim size is because whenever you're doing professional printing, you print off the edges. You make the file larger than when it needs to be. There are specifications for how much larger, and is it all the way around or just on some sides? And then even if it's a postcard or a business card or anything like that, any image that goes off the edge gets cut and trimmed so it looks nice and neat. There's no white space or borders there. So if you have a fancy header on the inside of your book, or you have a beautiful image on the outside on the cover, you want that image to bleed off the edge. That's why it's called bleed. You want to see no white space there. And so when you're designing a book, you have to make it a little bit bigger and think about where those images are going to get cut, because you don't want to have it cut where a person, like half their face gets removed by that little trim. So it's not going to be half their face. I'm exaggerating a bit there. But anyway, I have had it where something significant is cut off. So one of the most common trim sizes for paperbacks is 6 by 9 inches, especially in the nonfiction space. That one's really common. It's also used for some of the longer fiction books. I've seen 6 by 9. It's a really common size. I like to think of it more in business books, and I actually prefer my novels to be more of a 5.5 by 8.5. That's more typical of the paperbacks that you will buy in the store. But you just need to decide what is going to be that finished size. And then you're going to want to stick with it. If you're doing a series, you want all those books in the series to be the same trim size, because you want to be able to stack them up and have them all be the same. If we're hoping someone buys all 3 books in your series, right? So we want it to be the same. Your cover design has to match the dimensions perfectly. And when you're doing the cover design, it's going to be the whole cover. It's going to be the front, the back, and the spine. It's not going to be the front and the back and the spine assembled on some platform and while you're publishing. No, it's going to be done by you specifically, or your designer. It's going to be done and put into one file. And so you're going to see the back cover on the left, you're going to see the front cover on the right, and then the spine in the middle. It's going to be trimmed down during production and then applied to your book. Your design has to match perfectly, because if it doesn't, your book might end up cropped incorrectly. Beautiful parts of your design could be cut off, or you could have weird white borders around the edges, and nobody wants that. Now, one of the other things to keep in mind with that is that spine width is going to vary by page count. So we're going to talk about that in a second. So it does not mean you just make that file and it's the same for every book. Every single book is different depending on the page count. And for ebooks, you're going to be dealing with something different. We don't have a trim size for an ebook. We have an aspect ratio. Oftentimes, the cover for an ebook, when I'm uploading it to KDP, I end up using the same cover, just the front of that. But if you want it to look really good on devices like Kindles and tablets or even smartphones, there are aspect ratios that you can follow so that ebook fills all of the space. But because ebook readers come in all sizes and shapes, it's a little tricky to get it to look great on everything. So, for example, on my Mac computer, I have an iBook app, I guess is what we call it, a program where I can open ebooks. It looks different there than it does on a Kindle because the iBook one is specific more to my iPad. And so all of that makes a difference on an ebook. However, we don't spend as much time looking at an ebook cover. And so I pay a lot more attention to how the print cover comes out with those specific dimensions. And we're a lot more flexible with the dimensions of that ebook cover. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to talk about spine width. This is really important for print books. It's determined by two factors. One is the number of pages in your book, and the other one is the type of paper that you choose. The thicker the book and the heavier the paper, the wider the spine. And that will also affect some of those interior dimensions because the fatter the book, the harder it is to get it to lay flat, and the tighter the creases in the middle. And so it affects your margins. We're not going to talk about that here, but in case you're wondering, it does. So it affects the inside as well. But we're thinking about the cover. So the thicker the book and the heavier the paper, the wider the spine has to be. And there are calculators out there, like, for example, Amazon KDP has one. Ingram Spark actually has a template, and when you download the template, it shows how wide the full cover needs to be. So what I do when I'm designing a book cover is I have the front. I know that finished size is going to be, let's say, 6x9. I know the back's going to be 6x9, but I don't know how that total width is going to be with the spine until I'm done with typesetting and I know how long the book is. I have an estimate, but I don't have the exact page count until that's finished. So after I finish laying out the inside of a book and I know how many pages it is, I have to go back to the cover and then I have to finalize it and get everything very specifically. There are areas where you can't have text off the edge of the cover or it'll get rejected. And so that layout has to be very specific to that width. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago bleed, and I've mentioned margins. So let's talk about what that means. If you're printing physical books, I think bleed is a must on your cover. Absolutely a must on your cover. It's optional on the inside, and here's why. On the cover, you always have to extend beyond the full trim size in this buffer zone so that they can chop that little 1/4 inch area off. I mean, it's not even a 1/4 inch, it's 1/8 of an inch off, 0.125. They're going to chop that off so that you have no white space on the edges. Now, on the inside of a book, it's optional because you may not have any images that bleed off the edge. For example, in a lot of novels, all of the text stays within the margins, and it's not an issue. But I've done some nonfiction books where we do some fancy stuff like patterns that print off the edge of the page. We do images like a watermark that bleeds off the edge. And so it's optional on the inside. I pretty much always set up the file with bleed just in case we make that decision to add an image that bleeds. I don't want to have to add that later and mess with my margins. Now, margins. This is the area around where you don't want to have anything important. So when we're thinking about exterior margins on a cover, there's not like a physical area that we're not laying out a Word document with margins set up to say 1 inch all around, but there is a safe space that your publishing platform requires you to have nothing important in that area. So don't put your name too close to the bottom or a subtitle or a title too close to the top or too close to an edge. And so I always put, when I'm creating a cover, I actually create little margin lines in my design. So it just reminds me, don't put anything important there. Don't put logos close to the edge on the back, all of that kind of stuff. So when we think about a margin, it is the area on the actual cover that is included in the full cover, but where we don't want to have something important. And the bleed is the area outside of the cover edge that gets cut off. If that doesn't make sense, you can actually look up a lot about bleed and margins and setting that up. And it's just something that, like I said, is really important when you're doing a print book. Now, when we think about setting up the interior, I'll be talking about that in a separate podcast episode, but we'll be talking about some of these very same things. We'll be talking about bleed, we'll be talking about margin there as well. Now, when you're creating a file or when you're hiring somebody to create a file, it has to be in the proper resolution and file format for you to submit it for publishing. For print covers, your images have to be at least 300 DPI. DPI is dots per inch. Some of your design programs have PPI, which is pixels per inch, but just set that for 300. Now, if you get images, like say off of your phone, I've done some things with clients where they've taken a photo on their phone. It's high resolution, meaning it's a really big file. If, for example, it might be 5 megabytes versus a little tiny logo that's like not even a tenth of a megabyte. And so it might be a really big file, but it's only, oftentimes my phone only takes 70 DPI. It's going to get rejected if I use it for a cover. So I need to take that into my photo editing software, and I actually need to convert that to the high dots per inch photo. And this is where I know that it's tricky. We're talking photographer language, and I'm not a professional photographer, but the important thing to know is that your cover can look blurry or pixelated, and that's not the impression you want to make. So even if you're using a photo you took yourself, it's going to have to be converted into the right format. And speaking of format, the professional publishers don't want what's called an RGB photo that comes off of your phone. RGB is a 3-color format that's really meant for digital space. It looks great on actually looks fine on an ebook cover because that's a digital space. It looks fine on your phone. It looks fine on your computer. It looks great on all of those. Looks good on a TV, but it does not look good in professional printing where they use a 4-color process. So whenever I get a photo from somebody and they say, I want to use this on my book, or can you incorporate this in my book? I also take that into Photoshop and I convert it from the RGB where it came off their phone, and I put it into the CMYK, the 4-color, and I save it that way. So there's some steps to go through to get that high quality image that you're looking for. When you're uploading them, when you have a finished cover, it can't just be a JPEG or a PNG, which are the things we use for photos and websites and all that kind of stuff. It has to be a high quality PDF. It has to have the fonts flattened and outlined and all of those things so that it, like, let's say I give a file to a professional printer, but they don't have the fonts that I have. I have it all flattened so that it doesn't have to look for fonts. It takes the fonts and kind of turns all the text and everything into an image by the time I submit it as this high quality PDF file. And that way, there's no margin for error. It's going to look exactly the way I submitted it. If I submit it in a format that isn't flattened all the way like that, and their software tries to figure out what font I used, it's going to replace it with one that's going to be, I promise you, really ugly. So it has to be done this way. Just because ebooks don't get printed, it doesn't mean you can really let go on resolution. Like, don't use a really crummy low resolution photo in your ebook just because it doesn't have to be in as high quality format. I'll tell you, when you're shopping on Amazon, they take our high quality images and really, they turn them into something that looks blurry already. So if you start out with something blurry, it's going to look even worse when they put it in their little thumbnail. So you need to have high resolution, and you need to have the right color format before you submit that quality PDF of your cover. Now, if you aren't sure, if a photo takes up almost no space on an email attachment, like when people email me, I can open a photo. Actually, before I even open the photo, I can tell you it's not going to be high enough quality just because of the size of the attachment. I'm looking for something that's at least a megabyte when I'm getting an image from somebody, unless it's going to be a little tiny element that's included, like maybe a logo. That's not going to be that big. But if you're sending me a photo, like a headshot, and if you blow it up big on your screen and it looks really fuzzy, it's probably not going to work to use that on your cover as well. There are some tools out there, so if you're not sure, I've discovered that in Canva, I can actually take a lower resolution image and turn it into a higher resolution one and then export it. It's a multi-step process, but I can kind of get there. And the reason I've done this sometimes is someone will send me a vintage photograph of their grandfather or something that they want to use on a book, and all they have is something that was scanned in and it's not high quality, and so I kind of artificially turn it into one that works. There are some differences I've mentioned in ebook and print covers. For the most part, like I said, the print cover is going to be a full wraparound cover, and the ebook you're only dealing with the front. But you want to optimize it so that it works great on multiple screens. You also want to look, when you're doing a print cover, I always shrink it all the way down to a little thumbnail, like a little bigger than a postage stamp, the size that you would see when you're scrolling on Amazon when you're shopping. And that's because I want to know, when it's that small, can I at least read the title? And can I tell what the image is? Because if somebody can't tell what the title of the book is, and I made this mistake on my first book, and I still haven't even fixed it because the book is selling, but it's just one of those things that someday I'm going to fix, because I've book 13 just came out, and I definitely am doing them different now. And I do them different for my clients, because when you shrink it down to a little thumbnail size, if you can't read it, then it just cuts off half the people who might pause and want to look at it when they're scrolling. So as we recap here, let's just cover real quickly what I've just talked about in the technical aspects of book covers. Know your trim size and your aspect ratio. Calculate that spine width carefully based on your page count and your paper. Add bleed and margin so you don't get those errors when you try to submit your file. Use high resolution images and the correct file format, and then optimize your cover for print and ebook. Now, when you get these technical details right, you're setting your book up for success on every platform that you use. I can take that cover that I create and I can use it on KDP, and then I can put the same cover into the template that I use on Ingram Spark, and I can submit it to those multiple places with very small modifications because I've started with the right format. If you're working with a designer, make sure that they're familiar with these specs. I've had some people who have worked with professional people, but they aren't familiar with book publishing, and they've really struggled with getting it right. And so work with people who are familiar with book publishing requirements, and you'll have a lot less headache. If you're doing it yourself, you'll find some free templates and stuff that you can download to help you out on some of those platforms. You don't necessarily have to have, like I use Adobe software. If you're using KDP's templates, you can actually use their cover creator one and get like the spine and all of that figured out within that. So you'll find that helpful if you really want to do it all yourself. Thank you so much for joining me today on Indie Author Blueprint. And if you have found this episode helpful, I would love to have you leave a review or share it with a fellow author. As always, happy publishing to you for the indie authors out there. And if you are a paid subscriber to Indie Author Blueprint, you're going to have a bonus in your inbox. I'm creating extra steps and tutorials for people so that if you're a paid subscriber, you're getting that extra help in your publishing process. For everybody out there, when you subscribe, you actually get multiple files from me. And one of those is related to cover design. So you'll want to get that because that's a good freebie for you to have in your repertoire. I think that's how we say it. All right, so the bonus will be there in your inbox for those who are paid. Again, thank you for being here, and I will be back next time with our last episode in this cover series.